Tanaiste, first of all, I would like to express my deepest sympathies to Savita's family and to her husband Praveen as we face the anniversary of her tragic death on the 28th of October last year. And the report that was published by HIQA into the circumstances of that obviously was very difficult reading for the family. I suppose, Tanaiste, it was also very difficult reading for many people, particularly the women of Ireland and people who were involved in the frontline services of maternity care in this country. Reassurances were given last year by the HSE at local level in Galway that an implementation plan would be put in place to ensure that those particular services were monitored and that the failings would be addressed. But there is a bigger issue here, Tanaiste, and that is the national maternity services themselves. And the report goes on to highlight some of the deficiencies in the context of the implementation of the guidelines, for example, in the whole area of sepsis. But it also highlights another key issue, and that is that the lack of resources available to the delivery of frontline maternity services in this country is under huge pressure. We've had masters of the Rotunda, Holles Street, other obstetricians around the country highlighting this particular fact. And as I said previously when we've been discussing this issue, this is not a political point. This is about ensuring that women have absolute confidence in maternity services in this country. And I believe, Tanaiste, what is now required is that an implementation body would be set up immediately to assess and review the HSE's own commitments to implementing the particular plans that they have outlined, but more importantly, that the HIQA report in the context of Savita Halappanavar and nationally is implemented in full. So what I'm calling for really, Tanaiste, is will you commit to a full independent review and audit of maternity services in this country, the staffing and the resourcing of same, and that any deficiencies that are highlighted by that particular independent audit will be made available as quickly as possible. And one area, I think, Tanaiste, where we could move straight away. We now know for definite that the frontline services in the context of maternity care are under huge pressure. We have a lack of midwives, hospitals are under-resourced, we have a very low concentration of obstetricians in the context of the population, 70,000 births a year. We should have an awful lot more, and we don't. So I think in the meantime, would you commit to ensuring that, as I said, we act upon the report, but in the immediate area of lifting the embargo and moratorium on recruitment of frontline staff in the maternity areas, would you agree to do that?
Well, first of all, I want to join with Deputy Kelleher in again expressing my own sympathy and the sympathy of the government with Praveen Halappanavar and his family on the death of Savita last year. And the report that was published yesterday does make difficult reading for them and does make difficult reading, I think, for everybody with an interest in maternity services. I don't think there's a woman in the country that doesn't put herself in that bed in St Monica's ward, and I don't think there's a man in the country that doesn't see his wife or partner or daughter in that bed and ask themselves very basic questions about it. I've read this report. It's a very good report. It does what HIQA was asked to do, which was to get to the bottom of what happened in Galway, why it happened, and what lessons we can learn from it. It is, as all these reports are, written in careful language. But you know, reading through the careful language, there are a number of things, I think, that are very clear to us. It makes the point, I think, quite rightly, that everybody is entitled to be safe in our hospitals and to get the best quality of care. But when you look at some of the things that are said in this report, general lack of provision, basic fundamental care, for example, not following up on blood tests, failure to recognise that Savita Halappanavar was at risk of clinical deterioration, failure to act or escalate concerns to an appropriately qualified clinician when she was showing signs of clinical deterioration, ultimate clinical accountability resting with the consultant obstetrician who was leading Savita Halappanavar's case. We have to ask fundamental questions about was there somebody not doing their job or not doing it properly. And when we read recommendations in this that talks about governance failures, clinical governance arrangements within the hospital failed to recognise that vital hospital policies were not in use or nor were arrangements in place to ensure the provision of basic patient care in St Monica's ward, we have to ask very fundamental questions about the management and supervision of the service. When we read, for example, about the amount of time that clinicians were spending at committee meetings and the points that are made at that, one has to ask basic questions about how the HSE itself is governed and run. When we read the recommendations that are addressed to the HSE and to the Department of Health, we have to ask very basic questions about how our maternity services is provided in this country. When we see, for example, that 5 out of the 9 maternity hospitals had not delivered on a previous report that had been issued, we do have to ask very fundamental questions about the delivery of a national maternity strategy in this case. I want to say this very clearly. This is a very good report. There are recommendations in this report that are addressed right across the board, from the ward in the hospital to the desk of the Minister for Health. And those recommendations will be implemented. And I think what we need to do, what Savita Halappanavar is owed, and what this country is owed, and the women of this country are owed, is that the recommendations that are contained in this report are implemented with urgency, that the systems are put in place, that the supervision is put in place, that the coordination is put in place to ensure that what is in this report is implemented and is done, that we do not have another Savita Halappanavar case, and that the women of this country get the maternity care and the care in pregnancy that they're entitled to. That's what we will address. That's what the Minister for Health will address. And whatever audits or whatever independent examination or whatever will help with that, or will help oversee that, or will help ensure that it will be done, well, I'm open to those. But let's not go down the road of we have to have another audit or another report or whatever. We have a very good report here. Now let's get on with doing what that report asks us to do and implement the recommendations.
Billy Kelleher.
Thank you, Tanaiste, for the reply. Unfortunately, Tanaiste, we had a very tragic case only a number of years ago in Drogheda itself, in Tanya McCabe, who died in 2007. And there was national guidelines drawn up at that time with regard to sepsis. And only 5 of the 19 maternity hospitals are presently implementing those guidelines. And that has been highlighted in this report. We then had this tragic situation in Galway, but what has come to light since, in the context of the report, is that while you talk about governance structures and local management, the Department of Health is consistently referred to in this report as well. So it's not just an issue, Tanaiste, of pointing to local management and saying, well, you know, they must do better. Of course they must do better, but they must be resourced as well. And the point that is quite clearly and definitive in this particular report is that resourcing is a key issue in ensuring safety of maternity services in this country. And yes, it talks about governance, and yes, it talks about accountability, but at the key of it is the fact that resourcing is paramount in the delivery of maternity services. But Tanaiste, you also said that following on from the tragic death of Savita, you know, that we don't need another report and another audit, but we do need to insist and ensure that this particular report is implemented in full. The point being is that we've already had a report previously, and only 5 of the 19 maternity service hospitals have implemented a previous report. So the question I'm asking you is, what commitment can you give today to ensure that when we come back at some stage in the future, that every recommendation in this report will be implemented in full? Because it does say that the HSE must implement, but it also says that the Department of Health must implement. So that's not exonerating political people at all. That's putting political people directly responsible for the implementation of this report, and that includes all facets, including resources.
Thank you,
and we can't have a situation, Tanaiste, where we will implement the report in theory, but not resource the practice in the wards of our maternity units throughout the country.
I don't think there should be any issue of exoneration at any level in relation to this issue. This is not a time for anybody to be exonerating themselves. I think what we have to do here, and as I said, I've been through the report. I think it's very good. I think it's very detailed, and I think, albeit using some of the kind of guarded language that these reports use, I do think it gets to the nub of where the problems are. And I think at every level, I think that the actions needed to be taken to address what is in this report and to implement the recommendations that are in it. As you've said, there was a previous case in 2007. There was to be follow-up on that. Rising from that, what the report says is that the HSE reported that these recommendations were implemented at a local HSE level with regional HSE oversight. On inquiry, the authority noted with concern that only 5 of the 19 maternity hospitals or units were able to provide a detailed status update on the implementation of the recommendations from the Tanya McCabe report. But then if you look at if you look at what happened in Galway, they tell us, for example, that in that particular hospital, the hospital reported that 167 maternity and non-maternity patients in total required ICU care as a result of sepsis in 2011, 139 in 2012. But the authority, this is HIQA, found that at the time of the investigation, the hospital did not have hospital-wide guidelines in place for the management of sepsis in adult patients. Now, the issue is why was that? And I think we have to, that issue has to be addressed. We also have another statement which says the hospital had a guideline in place for the management of suspected sepsis and sepsis in obstetric care. However, the clinical governance arrangements were not robust enough to ensure adherence to this guideline. What does that mean in plain language? Does that mean that there was somebody who wasn't actually implementing or enforcing those guidelines, or does it mean that there was an attempt to enforce them and that they weren't complied with? And I think that needs to be, that needs to be addressed. As I've said, at every level. I think this report, I think we have to take it in its totality. This report doesn't spare any level of the health service, from the ward to the minister's office. And I believe that it has to be taken seriously, it has to be answered, it has to be addressed, and the recommendations that are in it fully implemented.
Thank you, Mr. The next question is from Deputy Mayor McDonald.
Gurmai got the last count, Corla, and Tanaiste, you said that the report makes for difficult reading. None more difficult than for, I'm sure, the Halappanavar family, the family of Tanya McCabe, for many other families, and indeed for any woman in particular, women of childbearing age and who at some stage may rely on the maternity services in this state. You described the report as a good report. I would describe it as a damning report. I think, as you have acknowledged, it registers failures in the most basic elements of medical care that Savita Halappanavar had every right to expect, including, very disturbingly, an absolute failure to recognise the vast deterioration in that woman's health. The mind boggles at the prospect of that. And of course, the difficulties that we have on this issue and the criticisms aren't, as you have acknowledged, simply restricted to St Monica's ward. And your language has been very evocative. In no doubt we can all imagine the scenario for Savita and the turn of events for her and for Praveen. over those fateful days. But of course, the implications of the report go far beyond that ward. And what we see now is a mirror held up to our maternity services, telling us very clearly that the vital safeguards, the most basic provisions in terms of good governance and good practice in our maternity services simply aren't there. The authors of the report found it impossible to provide assurances that women are receiving safe or reliable care during or after pregnancy. That's the sum total of it. Now, you say, Tanaiste, that questions arise from this report. I agree with you. Questions around accountability in the case of the particular hospital in Galway, in respect of local and regional HSE authorities. And a question of negligence arises, or malpractice. And I think that that is certainly, if not stated openly, it's implicit in the content of this report. But Tanaiste, not alone are questions raised by this report, but answers are demanded. So the implication of this report moves from the ward, St Monica's ward, as you say, through the HSE to the desk of the Minister for Health, and then it lands fairly and squarely on the desk of the Cabinet. So the answers that people want are, firstly, how will this accountability that you speak of be delivered? We've mentioned the previous case in 2007 of Tanya McCabe. At that time, guidelines were drawn up. At that time, we all resolved that we would have learned the lessons. Fast forward 6 years, those recommendations have not been implemented.
Thank you, Deputy.
We have another tragic turn of events, and the same sort of debate unfolds again. That's not accountability. That's a matter of farce, a very dangerous farce for women's health. So what about the accountability, Tanaiste? And crucially, what about the resources?
Thank you.
Next Tuesday is Budget Day. Decisions on spending will be made, decisions in the area of health. What comfort and what reassurance can you give to women, to patients, to users of the maternity services that the lack of resources identified fairly and squarely by HSE spokespersons as recently as this morning, that shortfall will be addressed?
Thank you. Tanaiste.
Well, I think what matters here, above any other consideration, above any consideration of political debate, above any consideration of different interests in the health service, making or lifting chunks of this report to perhaps support or defend a case that they're making. I think over and above any of that has to be safety for the patient and safety for women who are admitted to our hospitals during pregnancy. This particular case, this report says there were 13 possible interventions that could have been made in the period of time that Savita Halappanavar was in hospital that didn't happen. Now, resources is always an issue. Of course it is. But I don't believe, and I don't believe anybody reading this report can say that resources is the issue in respect of all 13 of the possible interventions that could have taken place. The report in the Tanya McCabe case was implemented in 5 out of the 19 hospitals. It raises the question of why was it implemented in those 5 and not fully in the others. It does appear to have been partially implemented in some of the others. I think that has to be looked at. As I said earlier, I think that what we have to do here, and I think this is a collective thing, I think we have to take this report, resolve that this should never happen again, and do what is necessary to make sure of that. And that means implementing the recommendations in the report. And I think, for example, one of the issues that is raised in this report is about the issue of whether, in terms of the deployment of our resources, whether we should continue to have 19 maternity hospitals or maternity units in the country. Well, I think that's an issue for all of us. Because if, for example, the Minister for Health comes in here and says, I want to rationalise the number of maternity, I want to have a smaller number better equipped, better quality, better standard maternity hospitals. Let's ask ourselves now, in all honesty, what is the response of that going to be?
Exactly.
So what I say to us all here is, I believe this is a good report. I think the recommendations in it are very strong. I think they should be implemented. I think responsibility for the implementation of those recommendations primarily rests with the Minister for Health, the HSE and management and so on. But I think also, I think there may be issues of choice, and there may be issues of general policy, and there may be issues of the deployment of resources that will ultimately be, I think, issues for all of us here. And I think when we come to address those issues, I think that we should address them with the best interests of the patient and the best interests of women at heart.
Margaret and Dr. Mary Lou McDonald.
Thank you,
Supplementary question.
Askan Corla. Well, when never again is said on this occasion, it needs to mean never again. And that means, Tanaiste, if I could suggest to you, that you ask the Minister for Health, James Riley, to explain to you, to Cabinet, to us in this chamber, how it is that only 5 out of 19 of those maternity facilities introduce those guidelines. We want to know why that is the case, and the general public ought to know why that is the case. Now, on the issue of resources, I really hope, Tanaiste, that you would not use this report or the tragic turn of events for Savita, or indeed for Tanya McCabe, as some kind of pretext to cut back on maternity services. Because you're right, we do have to take decisions about how you arrive at the safety that all of us require. I agree with you entirely. But can I tell you that for a heavily pregnant woman, the prospect of having to travel hundreds of kilometres to get to their maternity service, to a maternity hospital, can I just suggest to you, from experience, would not be a helpful thing, and would not be a terribly safe thing for women across this state. So we have not just the HSE spokesperson this morning, but the masters of the maternity hospitals saying for a very long time that they are struggling to cope with the level of births and the level of service that they have to provide in our maternity hospitals. We all know that. They've been saying it for a very, very long time. This report identifies failures in management, failures in accountability, including political failures, but it also raises the question of resources. And I am saying to you that if never again is really to mean never again, then we need to resolve the accountability and governance issues, including the role of the Cabinet and the Minister for Health. But we also have to be truthful about the resources that are required in our maternity hospitals. I mean, if you visit the Rotunda or the Coombe or Holles Street, and you see at times the bedlam at play in those very fine facilities, you'll be left in no doubt that there is a very acute resourcing issue on the front line. And I say that to you, Tanaiste, not to let anybody off the hook in respect of the lack of treatment and appropriate care for Savita Halappanavar. Let me just emphasise that to you. But simply to state that if we are serious about the safety of women and their babies and a quality maternity care service, you have to have a resourced front line. And on Tuesday, you will have an opportunity to ensure that that's the case. So can I ask you, Tanaiste, to be more specific around the implementation of these recommendations? Can I ask you, do you intend or have you spoken to Minister Riley, and will you ask him to come before this chamber without any delay to set out his response to this report, his response to the failure of hospitals across the state to implement recommendations many years on? And will you give a commitment to the women of this country that you will ensure that those resources are at the front line where women and their babies need them?
Margaret and Tanaiste.
We have a choice here with this report. We can take it now and we can use it as ammunition in whatever case we want to make. political case around the budget, around delivery of resources, case in the arguments that go on within the service about whether resources should be here or whether they should be there, arguments between one institution and another. We can use it that way. Or we can take this report, as I do, in its totality, and say that there are actions that need to be taken at every level. Shouldn't pick one, shouldn't use it just to go there, or to make this argument or to make another argument. Take this report in its totality and take the entire set of recommendations and determine that we're going to have them implemented. And as I've said, there are implications in this report for people at every level in the health service and every level of government, and every level of management and every level of delivery of service in the maternity services. And I think it needs to be implemented in its totality. There are issues of resources, of course there are, there always are. There are issues of the management of our maternity services and the quality of the maternity services that have to be addressed. But there are also issues, and I think this report is very clear on it, and this relates to a particular case, particular institution, particular service, and one very tragic, awful case. And there are implications on it for how the job is actually done, how the service is actually delivered on the in the ward, what actually happens when something goes wrong. And frankly, this report is shocking in terms of what actually happened in the ward, and in this particular case. And the report, I think, is also pretty clear as to where action needs to be taken and the kind of paths that need to be followed in relation to the taking of action on that. And I don't think that it serves the health service in its totality and the people who work in it and who deliver a high-quality service and who work hard and work diligently and work really professionally every day. I don't think it serves them well to ignore those aspects of this report. I don't think any aspect of this report should be ignored, and that includes the aspects of this report which land at the headquarters of the HSE, which land at the desk of the Minister for Health. They shouldn't be ignored either. What I would suggest, because I do believe that there does have to be accountability, both for what happened but also for the implementation of the recommendation in these reports. And what I would suggest is that the Health Committee of the House would be asked, or it itself indeed can ask, that the relevant people who have questions to answer arising from this report appear before that Health Committee in the first instance to address specific questions that arise from the report, and over a period of time to address the implementation of the recommendations in the report. We do have an public accountability system. That's the way in which the public, the people who pay their taxes for the health service, the people who depend on it, the people who have to access our hospitals and in some cases travel, as you said, Deputy McDonald, travel long distances in some cases to get particular care in hospitals. That's how we deliver public accountability for them, and I think that should be done. I don't believe that this report should be let rest. I don't believe it should be let lie. I think that there should be a resolve at every level to take what's in this report and the recommendations in it and to implement them.
Now for the technical group, I call Deputy Seamus Healy.
Tanaiste, before your government cut heating supports like the fuel scheme and the free electricity units, and remember these were cut in each of the last 3 years. In 2011 there was a reduction from 2,400 to 1,800 in the free electricity units. In 2012 the fuel scheme was cut by 6 weeks, and in 2013 the household benefits package, including the free electricity units, was cut again. Now, before these cuts, Tanaiste, we know that there were over 1,000 extra winter deaths in the Republic. And we know that the vast majority of those deaths were due to cold-related conditions, and that these cold-related conditions exacerbated underlying medical conditions like, for instance, respiratory illnesses. And we know these facts from professional research carried out and directed by Professor Goodman of the Dublin Institute of Technology, peer-reviewed, publicly funded through the Centre for Ageing Research and Development, and indeed launched by your colleague, Minister Pat Rabbitte. And we know that before the cuts that you introduced, that heating costs were much cheaper, were significantly cheaper in fact. In the last 3 years, gas costs have increased by 22% in 2011, 8.5% in 2012, 2% in 2013, a total of 32.5%. Electricity, similarly, 14.8% of an increase in 2011, 5.9% in 2012, and 3.5% in 2013, 24.2%. And oil in 2012 alone went up by 18%. We know from a recent press release from the St Vincent de Paul Society that the increase in energy bills in the last 3 years was €500 per family. Of course, that wipes out in total the value of the fuel scheme for 2013 and 2014. And we also know from the St Vincent de Paul Society that they now spend over €10 million per year for heating supports for needy families.
Question, please, Deputy.
The question I have, Les Cion Corla, are as follows. Is your government monitoring the increase in winter deaths due to cold-related conditions caused by your government cutbacks to heating supports? And do you know how many deaths the heating cuts have caused since 2011? And will you finally, Tanaiste, reverse these cuts, reverse these huge cuts to needy elderly families?
Margaret, Tanaiste.
The government is very much aware of the increase in the costs of fuel and the pressure that is putting on households, on families, and on elderly people. That's why there are a range of supports in place to support people with the cost of fuel. One of the things that is very clear is that the cost of fuel, cost of energy, the cost of gas, we are receivers of fuel, we're receivers of fossil-based fuels, oil and gas, and we're very much open to the way in which the price of gas, the price of oil, fluctuates on the world market. And that's why, at a strategic level, we're doing two things. One is to increase renewable energy in this country so that we reduce our dependence on oil and gas, and that we can have fuel, electricity and energy that is supplied at a lower cost. And secondly, it is why we're also addressing the issue of the retrofitting of homes so that their energy efficiency improves and the cost of heating them reduces. So far, about 250,000 homes in the country have been retrofitted. We're particularly concerned that the retrofit scheme would proceed, particularly for households with low incomes. €50 million has been provided to improve the insulation of 25,000 of the lowest energy efficient homes over a 3-year period. 1,000 of those now have already been done. Additional funding has been provided to address the retrofitting of local authority owned homes so that their energy efficiency will increase. I think we have to look at this in two ways. First of all, maintaining the support that we have for households through the fuel allowance, for example, but also we have to address it at the level of the energy efficiency of the home itself. And that's why the retrofitting of houses, getting a higher standard of energy efficiency and thereby reducing the cost of heating the home has to be a part of what has to be done, because ultimately that's the best way of doing it sustainably over a longer period of time.
Margaret, Deputy Healy, supplementary question.
Thank you, Les Ceann Comhairle. Well, as usual, of course, Les Ceann Comhairle, the Tanaiste hasn't answered to any question I asked him.
Yeah,
it's usual performance here, and sometimes you wonder whether it's worthwhile asking any question. But he does, of course, blame the world markets for the costs of increase in price, and well and good. But his response to that, the Tanaiste's response to increased costs, is to cut supports to needy families, is to cut the fuel allowance, is to cut the free electricity units, is to cut the household packages. Tanaiste, your government has deliberately and knowingly cut heating supports. And we know that cold-related conditions mean extra winter deaths. This policy, Tanaiste, is an act of social vandalism. And it is a matter of life and death. And really, do we have to wait until there are more elderly deaths before we find out what the exact position is? So will you now answer the question? Will you ask the Central Statistics Office, for instance, together with the Centre for Ageing Research and Development, to find out, seeing as you don't know, find out how many deaths your cuts have caused since you came to power in 2011? And I'll ask you again, will you reverse the cuts, the huge cuts that have taken place over the last 3 years and which your government are responsible for?
Thank you, Deputy. Final reply, Tanaiste.
Well, you know, there are occasions in this House where allegations are made that are seriously over the top. And I think that the allegation that the Deputy has made in this particular case falls into that category. This government, let's concentrate now on dealing with. Let's concentrate on dealing with the problem. The issue of fuel costs is something that the government is hugely aware of and is seeking to address. And I've set out for you the way in which we are seeking to do that. What you're doing is you're asking me to ask the CSO to produce figures for us. We'll ask the CSO to produce figures for us. No problem with that. We'll ask for advice from anybody that has advice to offer to us in this area. Any of the organisations representing older people in this country, we'll listen to what they have to say. We'll hear what they have to say. We'll take advice from wherever we can get advice. But there is a difference, Deputy Healy, between hearing that advice, addressing it in a reasonable way, and making the kind of over-the-top hyperbole that you've just engaged in. We will do. You asked. No. Wait a second. Now. Wait a second. You asked. Would we ask the CSO? You asked. Would we ask the CSO to produce figures for us? The answer to that question. Let me be clear to you, because you accused me of not answering your question. The answer to your question, Deputy Healy, is yes, we will. Okay.
Margaret Tanaiste.